Het kost layman's terms, like where you could understand it.
Great.
That would be good.
So there we go. We're talking about the kings today. So it'll be a real quick kind of scoop through about 4 books, but then we'll sort of rewind back to Solomon for a bit. But I think it'll be good just to get a general overview of the kings, as some of you all were here in past years when we did Life Lessons and Chronicles. You know, that was a fairly much blow by blow description of all those different kings. So we're not going to go and revisit that necessarily. You can watch all that stuff online. But anyway, so just to kind of give the rundown of where the kings started, it would have started with Saul, and that was a united kingdom. Okay, so that was Israel as a whole. Now, the United Kingdom there has nothing to do with the UK that's across the water. Okay, so this is where all 12 tribes are under one monarch. You know, so because basically what the Israelites had said at the end of Judges was, we want a king like everybody else. So God was then like, okay, we'll give you a king like everybody else. And that man's name was Saul. And Saul had no heart for God. He wasn't interested in spiritual things. Anytime things went wrong, he blamed everybody else, not himself, when it was obvious that it was his fault. But now, it doesn't say exactly in the Bible in terms of how many years that he reigned, but when you piece things together, he reigned for 40 years. Okay, so now Saul's death was rather sad. He committed suicide out in the field there, and also his son Jonathan had died, which was best friends with David. But anyway, God then raised David up, who was a man after God's own heart. David then reigned for 40 years. And after David then was Solomon. And we know again from the scriptures that Solomon reigned for 40 years. So this was the United Kingdom. But then after Solomon, things broke down and 10 tribes went to the north under a certain rebellious man whose name was Jeroboam. And so he took those tribes, and it ended up that those 10 tribes just went into a pit of adultery and idolatry and everything else that went against the 10 commandments of God. So they didn't have any good king at all. We'll run through a list of them and see how long they reigned and what happened. But basically, they just went away from God completely. Now, that doesn't mean that there were not godly people up in the north. There was people like Elijah, Elisha, other prophets that were always trying to get people to come back to God. And as we know from 1 Kings 19, that Elijah thought that he was the only one left. He thought he was the only prophet left. And yet God clearly said to him that there were 7,000 that had not bowed their knee to Baal nor kissed him. So there was good things going on up in the Northern Kingdom, but in terms of the political sort of spiritual stability, no, didn't really exist. Now down south, it was a different story. So we'll look then at the divided kingdom, and this basically you had what was called Israel to the north. So that was 10 tribes, and that was basically a man called Jeroboam. Was as it says throughout those books, Jeroboam made Israel to sin, and so that he led them into a very, very idolatrous sort of form of living. But Judah was the southern kingdom, and it was comprised of Judah and Benjamin. So those two tribes were to the south, but they were referred to collectively as Judah. And that was under the reign of Rehoboam, which was Solomon's son. Now, Rehoboam was no winner. He was an ungodly man. I think, it's hard to know where things went wrong, in terms, was it Solomon's parenting skills or lack thereof? I don't know, but the man ended up going down a path that was very, very rebellious. He was listening to his mates, and he made the workers within Judah work all the more harder for the same pay, basically, and just became a dog's dinner, and that all went.
Those two names.
Yeah.
What is was it Bohm?
Yeah.
What's it?
The Bohm on the end. I don't know. I would have to go and look that up. I would imagine that there was some kind of related something or another. I can let you know. So, yeah. Yeah. So, and yeah. So we'll endeavor to. I would know Jeroboam's name with the J on the end is usually some sort of reference. If it's not an ayah on the end, if there's a jur on the front, that means it has something to do with God. Okay.
Sit the two of them here at the same time, and
Yeah. Yeah. So, and yeah. Well, anyway, I'll look that up later. There probably is a commonality to their names. The ending is obviously the same. So, so up to the north, which was the 10 tribes. So basically, we had Jeroboam the first, okay, because there was another Jeroboam that came into power a lot later on. So he was referred to as Jeroboam the second. So this was Jeroboam the first, and he reigned for, as you see the dates there, 931 to 910 BC, and that was 22 years. Okay, so that was I would say for the kings in the north, that was a kind of a middle to long time. Okay, there were some people that didn't reign very long at all, which is what we'll find out. But 22 years seemed to be kind of on the longer side in terms of a reign. But he was a bad pill boy. So and then after him was Nadab. Now a lot of these kings were not necessarily successive in terms of it was the man's son. May have been, but sometimes there was a bit of a coup, and somebody else, got into power, and and their dynasty sort of lasted for a bit of time. But it was a real hodgepodge of people. So Nadab, he only reigned for 2 years. Okay. Then you had Baasha. Well, there's a somewhat of a longer reign, 24 years. And then Elah, again, a short reign of 2 years. Zimri, he reigned for 7 days. Okay, so that was something that didn't go terribly well for the man. And then Omri, he's 12 years. So and then there was Ahab. Now Ahab would probably be one of the more read about, popular sort of kings, and that's because Ahab was at the time of Elijah. Okay, so there's a lot of storyline about Ahab and Elijah, and Ahab is actually one of the few kings that's actually mentioned in the book of Chronicles, because Chronicles only covers the kings of Judah. They mention very, very little any of the kings from the north. So, but Ahab is mentioned quite a lot because Jehoshaphat, who's the king of the south at his particular time, he gets into a bit of a his daughters, Ahab's daughter gets married to one of the sons of Jehoshaphat, and then it ends up bit of an old twist up, which wasn't very good, doing political alliances. But after Ahab, there was Ahaziah, who reigned for 2 years. And then we have Jehoram or Joram. And again, this is the reason you got two names there that look different is because Jehoram is the one that's used in Kings and Joram is the one that's used in Chronicles. So it's the same person, just slightly different variation on the name. Because if you look at it in Hebrew, there's actually not a lot of differences. Like one letter, sort of of a difference. So. But he reigned 12 years. And then there's Jehu, and he reigned a fairly good long time of 28 years. Now, Jehu, if you remember again, 1 Kings 19, that Elijah was going to anoint Elisha as his predecessor. Or successor, I should say, and then Jehu was going to be anointed king. So this is sort of toward the end of Elijah's time, and then going into Elisha's time as being prophet. So, and then we have Jehoahaz. Okay, he reigned 17 years, and then there was a man of a similar sort of name, Jehoash, who reigned 16 years. And then there we have Jeroboam II. Now, you see the dates there of 782 and then 793 as a start date. Okay, and you're going, now what's that about? Why is there 2 dates? Doesn't the thing actually start at a particular start point? This was a situation of what is referred to as a co-regency, which is where a king and his son would then reign at the same time. So the son would be kind of the king's understudy, as it were, but he would have the same power. Okay, so the dating of some of these kings then gets a bit messy because how it says what it says is the start date may not necessarily be when the king's son was reigning alone, but it might have been when he started reigning with his dad in what that is called a co-regency. So anyway, but that whole period of time is 41 years. So quite a long time. Then you have this guy called Zechariah. He reigned for 6 months. Okay, not very long. And then Shalom, 1 month. And then we have Menahem, 10 years. Pekahiah, 2 years. And then Pekah, again, 20 years, but there was a co-regency there. So, and Hoshea, and he reigned up until 722 BC, which is quite significant because that is when you had the fall of Samaria. Okay, and so the Assyrian Empire, they then invaded Samaria, which is the northern 10 tribes, because their capital was Samaria, up north of Jerusalem. And so they took them into captivity at 722 BC. Now, when Jesus went to the woman at the well in Samaria, the Samaritans at Jesus' time were very, very disliked by the Jews. Okay, what you have to realize is that all Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews. Okay, Jews are from Judah. All right, So that's why they're called Jews. So the other Israelites that lived north, they were Israelites, but they weren't Jews. Okay, so in Jesus' time, the Jews were those from Judah, but the Israelites that had been taken into captivity in Assyria and then re-assimilated or repatriated back into the land of Samaria had intermarried and basically interbred with a pile of Assyrian people. And so from the Jews' point of view, you had a real big racial problem. Okay, so that's why the Jews really didn't like the Samaritans, because they were, to use a pejorative term, half-breeds. Okay, so now Jesus, that didn't bother Jesus. Okay, so he went and he spoke to the woman, and so then so actually, you had a lot of Jews that lived up near Galilee, and then you had a lot of Jews that lived down in Jerusalem and down where the Dead Sea was, and in the middle was Samaria. And so what the Jews would do in order to not go through Samaria is they would take the Beltway. I mean, they would take a big fat detour, miles out of the way, in order to not go through Samaria. But when Jesus was encountering the woman at the well, the Bible says it was, he needed to go through Samaria, and that was to encounter this woman because he was for them. So now the disciples didn't think this was particularly smart, but anyway. So Assyria, funny enough, was the first civilization to invent a postal system. So they developed a system of postcards, basically, where you could send a note on a piece of card or parchment or papyrus, or something like this. Not parchment probably, but because that would have been expensive, but papyrus, which would have been more paperish sort of stuff. And you could then send messages to other people within the Assyrian Empire. So they had the first successful postal system. So that's the Northern Kingdom. All these men, none of them followed God. They were all idolaters to the hilt. Okay, so they were not good people in that sense. Now, the Southern Kingdom is a completely different batch of folks. So I have them sort of color coded here. So we have Rehoboam, who reigned from 931 to 913 for 17 years. Rehoboam was a nasty guy. Okay, so he wasn't interested in things of God. He's in kind of orange, so I'm using orange as a bad color. Okay, but then there was his son Abijah. He only reigned for 3 years, but he wasn't a bad guy. Now I wouldn't say that he was brilliant, but he because the language that the Bible would use is basically they would name a person, he reigned such and such number of years, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, or he did not do what was right, or he did evil in the sight of the Lord. So that you don't find that sort of language attributed to Abijah particularly, but when you read about him in that chapter, there is a lot of his language where he attributes things to the Lord. So he is a man who is mindful of the things of God at some kind of level. So now you then had his son Asa. Now the other thing too about the Southern Kingdom is that everybody here is a son of such and such, and so there is a Davidic line. So these are all people that are a prodigy of David. So now Asa was by and large a good king. Now he reigned 41 years, which was quite a long time. Most of that time, now I have him green, but I have him underlined. And the reason I have him underlined is because there is something in the background that was kind of operating that wasn't great. Okay, so Asa trusted the Lord. did what was right, got rid of the idols in the land, commanded Judah to keep the commandment, as it says, which was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That was the commandment. That's what it uses, that language, singular, the commandment. So that was the first and greatest commandment. And and he built fortified cities, to keep themselves safe and all that stuff. So, but when it came to the end of his life, he got diseased in his feet, as it says, and he sought the physicians and did not seek God. And anytime that God's people were trying to give him advice and direction, he put them in jail. Which wasn't really the right thing to do. So he ended up dying as a crotchety old man. Okay, so he just ended badly. Okay, even though the majority, I would say probably 75-80% of his reign was pretty good. So, but he also didn't rely. He relied on certain associations with other people that weren't good. So now after him was Jehoshaphat, his son. Now I have Jehoshaphat in bold and in green because Jehoshaphat, I would say 95% of his reign was really, really good. Now, he was equated with David because when you go again through the language, it would say, King such and such did what was right in the sight of the Lord as his father so-and-so did. Now, it might be an immediate reference back to his dad, and maybe his dad wasn't all that, spiritually great, but he was all right. Okay. Whereas there are 3 kings in this list that are referred to as, Jehoshaphat, did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father David had done. Now, David wouldn't have been his father. David would have been his great grandfather. Okay. So, so we have three kings that are equated with David. So they were a good king. The only problem with Jehoshaphat is that he did make this alliance with Ahab up north, and which sort of rocked the boat a bit. But even in all that midst of that nonsense with Ahab, he did say to Ahab, is there a prophet of the Lord around here that we can talk to? Because Ahab was constantly raking up his own prophets that were saying, oh yeah, you can do this, do that, do the other thing. So
the alliances obviously were more people in the north and the southern kingdom.
Well, the northern tribes were smaller than Judah was the biggest of the tribes. Now, I would say probably from a population standpoint, they might have been marginally bigger, but each side would have had hundreds of thousands of troops.
But that's what I was thinking. Like if one were bigger than the other, alliances. Yeah, you generally make an alliance when they're both. A
lot of these alliances too were because basically I need protection from Egypt. So can you come and help me? I'll not tax you people on the border or something like. So there's a lot of kind of Donald Trumpian sort of stuff going on probably in some ways. So Jehoshaphat reigned for 25 years. There was a co-regency with him in terms of his start date and stop date. But then his son Jehoram, he wasn't great. He was. In fact, I missed out on the number of years he was reigning there. But anyway, it wasn't long because 8 so that was 7 years all in. But he would have started a little bit earlier with Jehoshaphat in the co-regency. So, but Jehoram was not a good king. And then there was Ahaziah. He only reigned a year. Okay, so wasn't much cracked with him, but he was a bad guy too. Really the reason he didn't reign very long was because Athaliah, who was the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab, okay, she was a nasty girl. Okay, she wanted to kill all the royal heirs. So as Ahaziah got it, but Ahaziah had a son called Joash, who was stolen away and kept in the temple compound, while Athaliah for about 6 years was rampaging around and desecrating the temple, doing all kinds of very, very obscene things. I mean, her big thing was the Ashtaroth, which was the Canaanite sex god. Okay, she just loved worshiping this idol. Okay, and made people get involved in all that kind of stuff. Well, it doesn't surprise us because, well, she's the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. But you had Joash then, who eventually does become king because Athaliah is then killed by there was the priest called Jehoiada, who was a good man, and he was very mindful to preserve the line of David. So that's why he made sure that Joash got kept away for 6 years in the temple complex. And but he made sure that Athaliah got killed eventually. So she died. And so then Joash became king. Now, the Bible says that Joash did what was right in the Lord all the days of Jehoiada, the priest. As long as Jehoiada was alive, he was dead on. As soon as Jehoiada died, then he pancaked. Okay, so that just shows that the man really, he was doing spiritual things, I would say, in the flesh, and he was doing it to be seen. And plus that he was involved in a big money project. And so I don't know, I can't remember how many times money is mentioned in that chapter of 23, I think it is, in Second Chronicles, but it says money, so it's just all about money. And so Joash never refers to God as his God. He always refers to God as somebody else's God. So he's talking about the Lord your God, not mine or ours. So as soon as Jehoiada dies, then Joash goes and listens to a bunch of other unspiritual people and then loses the plot. So he was a good king for a good period of his days, but anyway, there was an undercurrent there. There was Amaziah. Problem with Amaziah, as the Bible says, that he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, except not with a loyal heart. Now, I'm struggling to kind of square that circle. How you can do right before God, but really your heart's not in it. Now, I suppose any of us can pass ourselves, but and he probably did. But the Bible, is clear. He didn't do it with a loyal heart. So now he reigned for a good long time too, 29 years. So, but then you had his son Azariah, or Uzziah, as he's named in Second Chronicles. He was up till this point the longest reigning king. Okay, 52 years. So Uzziah, really, again, for a good majority of his reign, was a good king. It says that he sought after the Lord. He did a lot of. He was a man of the soil. Got the agricultural sorted out. Got security sorted out. It was at the end of his reign that Isaiah the prophet then came into pass, because it says in chapter 6 of Isaiah, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. Now, sometimes we read those sort of lines and we go, okay, that's just to give you an idea of when this happened. But I think politically, it's a really big deal, because if you've had a man reign for 52 years, that's more than a generation. So now, I'm sure you guys can probably remember when, maybe as a nipper, Queen Elizabeth came to the power, and you would remember King George. Now, there's not too many of those people kind of left in that sense, but Queen Elizabeth reigned for a long, long time. So the majority of the population of Britain would have only known Queen Elizabeth. So when Queen Elizabeth and then Charles then came into power, it was an upset, in terms of those things. So I think we can understand that a bit. So it was important for Isaiah, as probably a 17-year-old, when he had this vision of God being high and lifted up. This was in the midst of a lot of political turmoil, because it's like, what is his son going to be like? So, because that's all these people ever knew. Now, Uzziah, problem, he decided to burn incense in the temple. That wasn't his job. Okay, the priest did that. But he took it upon himself and decided to burn the incense himself. God judged him for that. He became a leper and then was a leper for a number of years until his son then took over. So, that left a bad taste in people's mouths, So, and obviously as a leper, you wouldn't have been able to interact with the people at all. So his son, Jotham, was part of a co-regency then, where, so you can see that there's 10 years of Jotham's reign that is actually overlaps with Uzziah's reign. So Jotham's son then would have been reigning in the place of Uzziah 10 years actually before Uzziah died. Right. So it was at the 42nd year of Uzziah that he went and burned incense in the temple, and then he was a leper then for 10 years. So Jotham didn't reign an exceptionally long time. It was only 16 years. He was again, okay king, not brilliant. The people still did idolatrous things under his reign, but he himself kept himself okay. But then his son, Ahaz, again, there was a co-regency there. There's a bit of a discrepancy in the sense of how long Ahaz actually reigned. Could have been 16 years or 20, depending on how you sort of calculated things. But Ahaz was not a good king. Now, then you had Hezekiah, who was Ahaz's son. Now, it's amazing how quickly, you have an okay king like Jotham, where the people are still mucking about. Ahaz comes in and lets everybody just muck about. And then Hezekiah then comes in as a very, very godly king. Now, where he got his godliness, I would say was from his mother. Okay, so now I did do a study back in the days of when we did the life lessons in Chronicles. We looked at the good kings in the book of Chronicles, where it talks about who their mother was, and looked at the meaning of the mother's name. And it was amazing how much God influence there was with those particular mothers. So Hezekiah, he reigned 29 years, brilliant reign. A lot of text that's dedicated to him. He was another king that was lined up with David. Okay, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father David had done. So, but Hezekiah was told by Isaiah. Isaiah was prophet during the last bit, very last bit of Uzziah's reign, Jotham's reign, Ahaz's reign, and Hezekiah's reign. Now, Isaiah went and told Hezekiah, look, you know, get your affairs together, pack up your goods because you're going to die. And so Hezekiah then cried his eyeballs out and, and said, Lord, I don't want to die. And then God catches up with Isaiah and says, go back to your man, tell him he has 10 years. And that's where the sun was made to go backwards. Okay. So backwards 10 steps. So, now, then comes the next son. Okay. So Hezekiah's son Manasseh is born during this time of the 10 extra years. Now, we don't know whether Hezekiah had any other sons, and maybe he didn't, and maybe that was the situation. And so he needed to have a son. But, it's kind of interesting that Manasseh ended up being the top worst king of them all. Now, look, he reigned 55 years. So now, in the book of Kings, it doesn't mention anything good about your man at all. Yes, and in all likelihood, he was the one that saw Isaiah too, with Saul. But Manasseh was taken to Assyria. He was taken into captivity, and the Bible says that they took him away with hooks. So this hook was likely a hook that was stuck under your chin through the bottom of your mouth, and you were walked behind a horse. So if things got out of hand, your head was ripped off. So that's what that is about. It's a grisly old thing. Now, when he was in Assyria, God visited him, and he repented of his damnable stuff that he did, and he was then reinstated as king back into Jerusalem. Now, he himself kept himself right before God, but the rest of the people, continued on in their idolatry and so on. So that's why I have Manasseh as underlined here, because there was a good bit.
Is that because they knew what he was at before that?
Well, yeah, I would say so. Yeah. So, anyway, so interesting character, interesting line of story there. And then you had Ammon, and he only reigned for 2 years. That was Manasseh's son. And then, so after Ammon was then Josiah. Josiah was the third king. Pardon me, that was likened to David. Okay, and Josiah really is then the last of the good kings. Now, the thing that Hezekiah and Josiah both do is they reintroduce Passover. So Passover was the big feast that they brought back into being as a national exercise. So Josiah reigned for 31 years, and then his son Jehoaz, there we go, he reigned 3 months. And the reason that happened was because Egypt had come and invaded the place and basically says, no, your man Jehoaz is not going to reign, but your brother is. His name was Jehoiakim, so he reigned 11 years. So Jehoaz and Jehoiakim are brothers. Okay, so but the king of Egypt didn't like your man Jehoaz, so he deposed him after 3 months and put Jehoiakim into place. But as the Bible says, and it only dedicates about that many verses, it's just a little handful of stuff. And then Jehoiachin or Jeconiah, he only reigns 3 months and 10 days. And then the last of them, Zedekiah, he reigns 11 years up to 586, which is when the fall of Jerusalem was, and when King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon came and took everybody into captivity for 70 years. So now, if you want to read about, you could well, here I'll go to the next slide and then I'll talk about these things. Okay, so anyway, you can see in green 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so there's 9 kings that were on the good side. Okay, bad kings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, so say half, roughly, because some of them didn't reign very long. So okay. Now, what I want to do is just run a bit of a parallel between Samuel and Kings and Chronicles in terms of how they cover material, because they're both covering the same stuff by and large. Now, I took this from the Believer's Study Bible, which is the Bible that I would use. But Samuel and Kings comes from a prophetic perspective, meaning there's a lot of chat about what the prophets are saying. So and a prophet is a man who speaks God's word to the people. So it's God's representative here on the earth, as it were. So you hear a lot from various sorts of prophets, especially like some Elijah and Elisha there in First and Second Kings. Now, Chronicles, on the other hand, is a more priestly perspective. There's a greater emphasis on sacrifice. There's a greater emphasis on the temple and spiritual things. Okay, in that sense. Samuel and Kings is more political history. All right, so it goes through and parallels or intermixes the northern narrative and the southern narrative, whereas Chronicles just talks about the Judah primarily. Now, so Chronicles is more of a religious history as opposed to a political history. A lot of wars, a lot of battles, and negative stuff. Okay, Chronicles would be where the temple is more prominent. Because the Chronicles, in terms of when it's talking about David and Solomon, it doesn't talk about the wars of David. It doesn't talk about the bad things that David did. Okay, very, very positive about David's reign. It's the same with Solomon's thing. So it's the record of both nations, both the North and the South. But Chronicles is just the record of Judah primarily. So the only king that's mentioned in any kind of a big way from the north would have been Ahab. Okay, it's continuing the history of the nation. So it is looking at both nations and how they're progressing when they get taken into captivity and all that sort of stuff. So it's more of a historical document, whereas Chronicles is more talking about the continuity of David's line. That's what's important. Because it's a priestly perspective, a religious history, what they're looking at is Messiah comes through David's line. So this is all about this messianic thing. Samuel and Kings talks a lot about manhood. A lot about manhood. Chronicles talks about God's faithfulness. So, some people might look at Chronicles, and interestingly enough, Chronicles is actually the last book in the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, it's in the middle of our Old Testament, but in actual fact, in the Tanakh, it's clear at the end. So it is a book that sort of wraps it up. It does a summary. Now, the Chronicles also has a lot of genealogies. It has the genealogy of David, and it has the genealogy of the priests. Okay. So that's just to give you a bit of a description of those two sets of documents. Now, let's yep.
I assume that chronicles were written by the priests.
I would say it was written by, I would say that's probably a safe bet. They don't know who wrote chronicles, but
I think the kings. I had a sort of chronological Bible, and it's very interesting. You know, when you go to the passage in Kings and Samuel, and then you go to Chronicles, it goes immediately to Chronicles. But very interesting, the difference.
Yeah.
Very, very clear. But it's just a very wee daft question. Like, it doesn't matter who wrote it. Like, the day it was God wrote it.
Yes, but I would say that there would have been, there would have been. They were quite fastidious about maintaining records.
Yes.
So it wouldn't have been just an oral tradition.
Oh no, I agree.
Yeah. So, but this stuff would have been, compiled and then summarized, because how Jews did their writings quite often was through summary. It wasn't, some of the narrative, especially about Hezekiah, was quite detailed.
Yes.
Whereas you could have had a king reigning for a similar amount of time, and you have 2 paragraphs of that. But they felt what was important was to highlight a thing, or summarize it using, Okay, let's just back up a little bit, and we'll just look at Solomon's dream here, and we'll just read through this in the last sort of few minutes. So this is 1 Kings 3. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about Solomon, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to then jump to Ezra. Okay, so I'm going to. So it says, now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, which unfortunately is a bad thing to do. But anyway, he married Pharaoh's daughter, and then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. And meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. So people would have then sacrificed on hills to God. Unfortunately, them same places were also, you could have had an altar for God here, and then an altar for, Shemash and Moloch and stuff, sitting 10 feet away, so on the same stupid hill. But anyway, they didn't have the temple. Okay, they did have the tabernacle, which collectively should have been what it should have been, but again, people were sacrificing in high places to God. Verse 3: Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Again, David had the vision for the temple, but the temple wasn't built at this particular point. Okay, now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. And at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask, what shall I give you?" Boy, what a question. So Solomon said, "You have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child, and I did not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours?" And the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And then God said to him, "Because you've asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall there be any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Therefore Solomon awoke and deep in a dream, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant. The Lord offered burnt offerings, offered peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Now, let me just look at, break this down just a little bit here. So we have Solomon's response, and basically he acknowledged God's mercy, because he's that which David did not deserve. Okay, so God is using this word for mercy, which is this common word hesed, which is loving kindness. Again, the Jews fully understood that because God exercised hesed toward the people, mercy and loving kindness, that it was incumbent on them to do the same to each other. So, but how important it is that he is acknowledging God's mercy, and mercy is also seen, because of what it states in the word, which is protection and support for the poor man. So, so Solomon understands this. He understands that he himself is poor, because he references that. Not so much poor materially. He would have been poor in spirit. So he says, "I'm little. I'm a child." So he acknowledged David's walk before God too, and it's very interesting the things that he cites in David's walk before God. He acknowledges truth, okay, which is this idea of being stable, being certain, being assured. So it's the Hebrew word emet. And what a great thing to be able to acknowledge in his dad. His dad was truthful. There's an awful lot of kids today that can't say that about their parents. But Solomon was able to do that with David. He saw righteousness. Meaning he was just and virtuous. Now, was all of David's life tempered by that? No, it wasn't. But there was a sincerity about David's walk. Because at the end of the day, he says, the only thing that matters here is your walk with God. And then he also cited uprightness of heart, which really talks about the straightness of the inner person. What the Strong's definition uses is the word rectitude. Meaning that you're straight. Okay, you've been rectified. You've been sorted out. You were at one point crooked, and now you're straight. And so again, David learned from his things. He did wrong things, but at the end of the day, he sought to be upright in his heart and blameless in how he walked. So these are the three things that Solomon cites within David. So it's a real challenge to my heart, and hopefully it's a challenge to your heart to say, how am I presenting to other people, my kids, my grandkids, people in church or whatever, can it be said of us, that man walks in truth, that man walks in righteousness, that man walks in uprightness of heart. That's a big challenge. So he acknowledged that God is continuing the line Because he is saying, that God, had David on the throne, and now God is putting Solomon on the throne. So there's a continuation of this line. I would say Solomon, because of how in touch David would have been about messianic things, would have certainly been able to recognize that as well. That he himself is part of this line that eventually Messiah would come. He acknowledged his limitations, which is a demonstration of humility. So therefore, the need for godly wisdom to lead God's people to be able to discern between good and evil. So I think when you put those four things together, you talk about mercy, you talk about walk, you talk about the continuation of the line, and you talk about your own limitations. You know what you need? You need wisdom. So that's what Solomon then asked for, because he knew he was going to be in a leadership position. And again, leadership is about having influence with people. All of us in this room and online here are leading because we're having influence with somebody. Could be your kids, could be your wife, could be people within church, could be the person down in the shop that respects you. So he was going to be leading God's people, which he had identified at the time as being more numerous than you could count. And they needed to be able to discern between good and evil. Now, God's response to this is pretty short. Okay. First of all, he's pleased with what he's asking. And then secondly, God granted wisdom and understanding to Solomon. He says, well, basically, according to what you're telling me, that's it. There we go. So God gave him this thing. Now, we then know from the scriptures that God had Solomon write about 90% of Proverbs. Okay, the last two chapters of Proverbs, chapter 30 and chapter 31, are not of Solomon, but the first 29 chapters are. Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon. Now, we do know from the scriptures that Solomon wrote 1,000 songs. Okay, now we have a grand total of 2 in the Psalms that are attributed specifically to Solomon, and that is Psalm 72 and Psalm 127. So my plan is for next week to go and look at those 2 Psalms. Okay, so now if you Google and say, what Psalms did Solomon write? You will find popping up 18. I was like, all right, 18. What are they? And then when you dive into Mr. Google says, well, there's pseudo-Solomatic Psalms that, or something, or pseudo or some kind of funny language, where there was some Psalms that were attributed to Solomon, but they're not in the canon of Scripture. So you will not find them in the Bible. Okay, this 18 of whatever they're talking about, you will not find them in the Bible, because when you dive into Mr. Google, it'll tell you they are, attributed to Solomon hundreds and hundreds of years after the fact. So anyway, so in the book of Psalms, there is 2. Okay, Psalm 72 and Psalm 127. But Proverbs 1:1-7. I just want to look at those verses there briefly, and then look at the verse in James, and then that'll be us for today. But this is how Solomon starts off Proverbs. He says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding. So now the reason I have these words in green is because what wisdom is not just, yes, God gave him the ability to do this, but it had to be practiced. It had to be ascertained. It had to be worked on. So how wisdom and instruction is gleaned is you need to know it. Okay, so you just don't know stuff. Knowing things takes effort. Perceiving the words of understanding, yes, I think God gives you the ability to see things, to harness things and to understand that, and you go, oh, never seen that before. But again, you have to be looking. Okay, you can't be going, right, my eyes are closed, okay, God, show it to me. And if your eyes are closed, you won't see anything. So, and then in the next verse is to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity. So, so there's these three things here, 4 things, sorry. Verse 4, to give prudence to the simple and to the young man knowledge and discretion. Yeah, okay. So there's four of these action words here. Know, perceive, receive, give. Interesting cycle of stuff, isn't it? So you know it, you get it because you're looking at it, and then you got this into yourself, and then what happens? You give it. So, the wisdom of God is never to be just ingested and you don't give it back out. So the next verse is, this is what the wise man will do. Okay, so a wise man will hear, increased learning, man of understanding will attain wise counsel. So this is practiced stuff. To understand a proverb and enigma, words of the wise and their riddles. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but the fools despise wisdom and instruction. So there's these things that you do initially, and then as you're the wise person, you'll hear this, you'll increase in the learning, you will attain to wise counsel, you'll understand this stuff. You'll get it right. Now that takes practice. So often my kids, when they were growing up, it's like, I don't know if I could do that or not. Well, have you tried? No. So, and then they're afraid to actually go and try because they might screw it up. Well, how many of us have done things and screwed things up, but that didn't prevent us from trying again. So, and then the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Now we did a study there not too long ago about the fear of the Lord in the book of Proverbs, and that's where it starts. Now, the Hebrew words for wisdom or wise is found 102 times in 96 verses in Proverbs. So that's pretty sizable. Okay, so that's the word. There's about four related words that are translated wise or wisdom in the Bible. So they're all it's either hakma or something like that. So, so when you go through the English Bible, you'll get a similar sort of numbering, but when you go into the Hebrew and sort of dig it out that way, you end up with these particular figures. Now, just to finish up, in terms of wisdom as it is described as a thing, in the book of James, and the book of James in the first chapter, it says, if a man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally and without reproach. But in James chapter 3, there's a bigger discussion about wisdom. This is where we'll finish here. So, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom, okay, this particular wisdom, does not descend from above. It is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Okay, so earthly wisdom doesn't have a great sort of CV attached to it. It's referred to as earthly, sensual, demonic, confusing, and it's evil.
See that in the word.
Oh my goodness. So you can see that in spades. So, but it says in verse 17, the wisdom that is from above. Okay, so I love how James is very, very practical. James doesn't mess around. He's very clear, because he says, basically the wisdom that does not descend from above, in other words, it's down there, is this, okay? And then he says, now the wisdom from above, which is up there, so, you're going, yes, okay, got this, so it's very, very clear. So the wisdom that is from above is first pure. So it has to be of a pure, undefiled quality. It's then peaceable, which, again, when you can compare that to the world's wisdom, peaceability doesn't exist. So it's peaceable. It is gentle. So it does not, cause agitation. The wisdom of God is challenging, but it works. It gets there and you go, that's what it should be. And that makes me feel okay. Now, the only reason you might not feel okay about it is because you're too bent on having your demonic and earthly and sensual wisdom about yourself, which only brings confusion. Okay, now willing to yield, we've talked about this before in the past, but willing to yield means it is open to being corrected. Which, now, God's wisdom doesn't need to be corrected, but the wisdom that God gives man is not so pig-headed about it. You're like, okay, if I'm wrong, I'm open to being corrected. Because you see, if you read the book of Proverbs, it says the righteous man or the wise man takes the correction. The fool does not. Okay. So it's full of mercy. It's full of good fruit. So if you think about good fruit, just look at the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. So the wisdom of God contains all that. It's without partiality, which means that it doesn't take sides. It's completely objective, but objective in the sense that it is not hypocritical either. I've watched some of these things online where people are debating with Christian people about God and theology and different things, and so this one guy says, well, you're not being objective because you're not taking into account that the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of this, that, and the other person, aren't in the Bible. They should be in the Bible. And so your man Cliff, whatever his name is, said, yes, but those particular documents don't agree with the bulk of the canon of Scripture, which is those other books feed into the narrative of Gnosticism, which is the body is completely and utterly bad, and it's only spiritual things that are good. Well, actual fact is probably the reverse, So, but you can't be objective and accept as equally legitimate things that are wrong. That's not being objective. That's being stupid. So, but that's how the world goes, because they say, you need to tolerate me. But the world says you have to tolerate me to the point where you accept my position as equally valid as yours. That's the new tolerance. But that's not real tolerance, though. So wisdom here is all these things. It's pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, doesn't take sides, and it's without hypocrisy. In other words, it doesn't is not two-faced. So, and God, we have a lot of that in the world, a lot of hypocrisy. So, and it says, now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So, the wisdom that's described here, when you take that green stuff and you apply it into Proverbs, for instance, you'll see all that. So, and you certainly won't see, in terms of the wisdom that does not descend from above, all that earthly, sensual, demonic, confusing, evil stuff. You will not see that in the book of Proverbs. So, so we'll have a little bit of a discussion next time about those couple of Psalms. Maybe look at a few other odds and ends in Proverbs. But then after that, we'll sort of go into the last of the historical books, which is Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and then talking about Psalms and Proverbs and all those kinds of things. Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon are interesting sort of books, and when you understand at what time in Solomon's life he wrote these things, then that informs us in terms of kind of why he come up with such stuff. But anyway, so there you go. Use those, and we're that one.
Yeah, I was confused.